After being detained in a maximum security penitentiary, the minions manage to escape and have to devise an escape plan to avoid being caught by the police again. Today we're going to recap the story of the Minions and More Movies, Volume 1 and 2, from 2022. The first story is called Yellow is the New Black. Dave and Stuart are being held in a penitentiary, but unlike their friends, the two brothers only think about having fun and, because of this, they end up attracting the attention of the sheriff. In an attempt to reprimand them for their bad behavior, the man takes the pair out into the desert, where they must collect all the garbage they find. To ensure control of the prisoners, the guards decided to chain them together, but for how this was a factor in facilitating their escape. Seeing a truck approaching, the inmate throws the minions at the power cables and uses the chains to slide down to reach the vehicle. Hal then reaches into the trunk of the truck and pulls the pair out with him. Immediately, the police go after them, but when they catch up with the truck, they discover that the trio have managed to escape once again. At this point, the sheriff realizes that he will have to call for reinforcements and, while countless vehicles drive around the town looking for the fugitives, the three of them always find a way to escape. That night, while they are crossing a train track that runs through the middle of the forest, Dave ends up getting stuck in the ironwork and is about to be crushed when his brother runs to help him. The pair then duck down and manage to stay safe as the train passes over them. At that moment, the chain is broken and Hal takes the opportunity to escape alone, but is chased by the police, who don't even notice the minions on the tracks. However, after catching the prisoner, the sheriff goes after the little ones and they run into a circus to hide. When the police find them, the two brothers are already inside the cannon and throw their bodies far away. What Dave and Stuart didn't imagine was that they would be thrown back into the penitentiary and end up back at square one. We will now move on to the story called Minion. In a prehistoric age, where cavemen still roamed the planet, minions were already out there causing mayhem. When he realizes that his bananas have been devoured by the yellow creatures, the troglodyte is furious, but spots a bull grazing a few meters away and leaves his son with the minions so that the child is safe. However, when his father walks away, the baby starts attacking Kevin and then goes after Stuart. The boy then uses his rattle to hit the minions and Kevin decides to tie him up with a vine. Now that the child can no longer walk, Kevin throws his rattle at the top of a mountain, arousing the boy's fury. Immediately, he starts throwing rocks at the minions and the pair have to hide to avoid being hit. In the meantime, the baby manages to free himself and climbs the mountain to get his rattle back. The problem is that he ends up falling and, before the minions can save him, a pterodactyl appears and captures the child. The animal then takes the boy to its nest, where he will soon be served as food. So Kevin and Stuart rush to rescue him. When they arrive at the nest, the pair spot the baby trying to destroy the eggs and try to stop it, but just then, the pterodactyl appears and starts chasing them, as it becomes furious when it discovers that they are trying to break its eggs. Immediately, the minions have to go down the mountain with the boy in their arms and use the skeleton of an animal to slide over the rock. However, when they reach a cliff, they end up falling and are once again captured by the flying dinosaur, which ends up being eliminated after crashing into a mountain. Just then, the trio manage to return home and arrive seconds before the caveman appears with his prey on his back. Luckily, he doesn't find out what happened and orders the minions to cook dinner. While the pair argue over who will be the first to eat, the baby devours all the meat and, when his father turns up, Kevin and Stuart take all the blame. Furious, the troglodyte runs after the minions with a wooden club in his hands and the boy celebrates the fact that he hasn't been discovered, but his punishment comes soon after and once again he is captured by the pterodactyl. We will now move on to the story called Panic in the Mailroom. In a warehouse where various types of waste are dispatched, Mike is responsible for stamping the boxes while Ken distributes the packages into different categories. However, instead of paying attention to his work, Ken prefers to play and receives a scolding from his friend. At this point, he decides to put the video game away and starts playing with the boxes. In doing so, Ken ends up clogging the pipe where the toxic waste is sent and Mike tries to resolve the situation. While trying to unclog the pipe, he comes into contact with an unknown substance that turns him into a lilac monster. Terrified, Ken begins to scream, but Mike quickly returns to normal and the only thing different about his appearance is his hair, which is still purple. Apparently, the creature doesn't remember what happened, but every now and then it transforms into the monster and starts devouring the boxes. As the packages aren't reaching him to be dispatched, Ken takes the opportunity to continue playing and starts laughing as he watches his friend undergo successive transformations. Suddenly, a box containing 3 kittens appears on the conveyor belt, so Ken rushes to save them and prevent them from being devoured by the creature. At this point, the minion begins to be chased and has to climb a pile of cardboard boxes to save the felines. Luckily, just as he was about to be attacked, Mike returns to normal and ends up falling off the pile of boxes. Ken quickly comes down to help his friend and he manages to vomit up the lilac goo he's ingested. In doing so, Mike accidentally contaminates the kittens, which turn into giant monsters ready to devour them. We will now move on to the story called Training Wheels. The ice cream truck is passing through the neighborhood and, on spotting it, Margot and Edith pedal quickly to catch up. While trying to keep up with her sisters, Agnes ends up falling off her bike and the minions come over to help her up. In an attempt to help the girl learn to ride a bike, the minions decide to take her to the lab and, while she trains on an exercise bike, Kevin and Stuart build her a unicorn motorcycle. The following week, as the ice cream truck approaches, Agnes finally manages to catch up with it, but her happiness is interrupted when a thief escapes from the jewelry store he has just robbed and steals the ice cream truck to get away. Furious, Agnes decides to go after him and turns on her motorcycle's jet engines to catch up with him. During the chase, the girl has to dodge a giant ice cream and almost has an accident. At that moment, one of the propellers on her motorcycle came loose and hit the truck. Just as she was about to crash into the vehicle, Agnes activates the parachute and manages to save herself, but an explosion occurs and the assailant is thrown onto the windshield of the police car. On that day, the little girl gets to eat her long-dreamed of ice cream and is featured as a hero in the town's newspaper. After the bike was destroyed, Agnes had to go back to using her old bike, but the minions made some changes to it and, with just one click, the girl manages to transform her bike into a flying suit. We will now move on to the story called Competition. In a secret laboratory built underground, Phil and Stuart decide to use their free time to hold a tic-tac-toe competition. But when he realizes he's losing, Phil gets angry and, after crumpling up the paper, throws the ball into a garbage can. After seeing his beautiful shot, he challenges Stuart, who manages to hit the basket from an even greater distance. The dispute continues and Phil manages to break his friend's record, but the little guy doesn't let up and challenges him to a fight. Phil readily accepts the challenge and, at the push of a button, a boxing ring appears in the middle of the laboratory. After putting on their gloves, they enter the ring and start a duel, neither of them coming out on top. So the pair start a fight of thumbs and once again fail to name a winner. Furious, they begin to pummel each other until all their energy is completely exhausted. A few hours later, Phil and Stuart try to resolve their standoff by creating a new competition and now they have to race in a wheelchair equipped with fire extinguishers. Phil is the first to test this technique and they both soon realize that it was a bad idea, as they wreak havoc in the lab. After falling from a bridge, instead of despairing, they start a race to see who can reach the ground faster and grab onto 2 bombs to increase the speed of their fall. When they realize what a mistake they've made, it's too late, but luckily the pair manage to survive the explosion. At that moment, they find a sheet of paper and spot the rubbish dump, so they decide to continue the competition, even after all the disaster they've caused. We will now move on to the story called Santa's Little Helpers. While crossing a snowy mountain, the driver responsible for delivering imported goods ends up letting a box fall off the truck. Believing that they have arrived at their destination, the minions come out of hiding and prepare to enjoy a week at the beach. They planned to travel to Miami, but to their surprise, they ended up in Finland. Within minutes, the trio start to freeze and spot a mansion full of lights in the middle of the snow. Quickly, Kevin, Stuart and Bob run there and, looking into the window, see several elves working on making toys. So the minions decide to dress up to join them and manage to blend in with the group. However, when they start building Christmas toys and sweets, the trio can't keep up with the pace of production and end up causing a lot of chaos. Furious, the chief elf decides to send them to the stable and, while his friends are cleaning up the waste on the floor, Bob meets a reindeer baby. Enchanted by the animal's cuteness, he decides to set it free and all of Santa's flying reindeer manage to escape. At that moment, the minions use blinkers to capture the animals and fly off through the mansion. While trying to escape, the reindeer end up getting caught in high-voltage wires and are electrocuted along with the little ones. Then they end up falling right in front of a sleigh full of boxes and, when Santa Claus appears, everything is ready for him to distribute the toys to the children. However, before the old man can get into the vehicle, the reindeer decide to leave with the sleigh, so Kevin, Stuart and Bob are in charge of delivering this year's Christmas presents. We will now move on to the story called Puppy. Dave is cleaning the window of his house when he sees some neighbors walking their pets and falls completely in love with them. He immediately grabs a leash and calls Kyle for a walk, but, as usual, the dog is in a bad mood and refuses to accompany him. So Dave decides to leave the house and tries to convince the animals on the street to go for a walk with him, but they all hide, so the minion tries to put the collar on the ladybug that lands on his finger, but gives up straight away. Suddenly, an alien appears and Dave is startled to see the insect being devoured. He then has the idea of taming the creature and takes the alien for a walk. That day, The two spend several hours playing together and Dave discovers that Puppy is able to increase the size of any object, including food. Over time, the alien gains a foothold in the family, until it destroys the TV in the living room and Gru kicks it out of the house. That night, Dave and Puppy spend a lot of time in the garden and the Minion discovers which planet that alien came from. Realizing that his little friend is homesick, Dave decides to send the coordinates so that his family can pick him up. So, the next day, when he meets his family again, Puppy is extremely happy and, before leaving, returns the insect to his friend. Now Dave will no longer be alone, as he will have a giant ladybug to keep him company. We will now move on to the story called Minion Scouts. Margot, Edith and Agnes have just returned from a scout mission and are very excited about the medals they've won. Hearing the girls' stories, some minions decide to join a scout group and go camping with the badgers. Determined to earn those badges, their first mission is to set up a tent, which will be their home for the next few days. However, they find it extremely difficult to work as a team and are the only ones in the camp who can complete this task. Hours later, when it's almost dark, the quartet has to light a bonfire and sees all the children receiving medals while they fail miserably yet again. The same happens when the guide takes the group into the forest to learn how to use maps and communicate with the animals. After eating hallucinogenic fruit, the minions go into a state of ecstasy and start rolling around in the mud, leaving all the scouts worried. Days go by and the little ones continue to fail at every mission they set out on. On the last day of the trip, they finally manage to light the campfire and are about to receive their first medals when Kevin's bomb blows up the dam and the camp is completely flooded. Upon returning home, the girls ask how their friend's adventure went and the minions start to cry. In an attempt to console them, Agnes and her sisters give some of their badges to the trio and the badger guide relives his worst nightmare when all the other minions decide to become scouts to earn their own medals. We will now move on to the story called Mower Minions. After seeing an advertisement for a blender on TV, the minions decide to open their piggy bank to buy the appliance, but only find a quarter inside. So they decide to work to make a little extra money and steal the gardening equipment of a guy who has just mowed his neighbor's lawn. After a few minutes walking around the neighborhood, the group finds their first customers, but, as usual, they make a big mess while providing gardening services. Despite not being able to do the job properly, the little ones make the elderly people who live there laugh and Gertrude decides to give them a container full of coins as a reward for the fun they have provided. After getting the money they needed, the minions finally buy the blender, but they end up falling for another advertisement that presents version 2.0 of the appliance and they go after a new extra income to be able to buy the appliance. We will now move on to the story called Super Gidget. When he discovers that a gang of squirrels has captured Max, Super Gidget goes after them and climbs a giant tree to rescue his friend. After defeating dozens of rodents, she finally reaches the top of the tree, where she finds a house made of wood. When she gets there, she encounters a vicious bulldog and, to her surprise, discovers that the dog is being controlled by a flea called Infestor. The insect has the ability to control minds and claims that it will soon take over all the dogs in the city. On hearing this, Gidget charges at the creature and Infestor sends the bulldog to attack her. During the battle, the dog activates her super bright rainbow to strike her opponent and manages to throw him far away. At that moment, the flea leaves the body of its host and takes control of Max. After freeing himself from the chains, the dog walks towards Gidget, because Infestor knows that she would never be able to attack him. When cornered, the dog decides to use a vacuum cleaner to catch the insect and manages to free Max. She then flies into space and throws the vacuum cleaner at the moon, putting an end to Infestor once and for all. After saving the city, Super Gidget takes Max back home and the two are about to kiss when the flea returns seeking revenge. However, when she goes to attack him again, the dog ends up hitting her head on the wall and wakes up. She then discovers that it was all just a dream. We will now move on to the story called The Secret Life of Kyle. Kyle is the most hated animal in the neighborhood and the letter carrier's greatest terror. What nobody imagines is that when Agnes and her sisters leave the house, the grumpy dog goes to visit the neighbor's poodle, with whom he is completely in love. However, after discovering that Bella has already been taken by a handsome German shepherd, Kyle is heartbroken and wanders aimlessly through the streets. During his walk, he passes a pet jewelry store and finds the perfect collar for his beloved. Believing that he can win her over with that object, Kyle breaks into the store and Miriam, the owner, decides to give him the collar as a present. The dog quickly returns to his neighborhood and runs to the neighbor's house with his collar in his mouth. However, the German shepherd is there to mark his territory and finds a way to get rid of his competitor. Seeing him approaching, he puts a skateboard in Kyle's way, so the animal ends up having an accident and falls in front of Bella. At that moment, he spits out the rubber toy he had accidentally swallowed and, to his surprise, The dog is more interested in the toy than the collar. When she hears her owner calling for dinner, Bella leaves and, before entering the house, gives Kyle a wink. At that moment, the dog realizes that this is the happiest day of his life. We will now move on to the story called Wagon Ho. Once Lur has just arrived in the forest of Trufula when two bears appear and climb into his cart. The man then forbids them to ride in the cart and says he'll be back very soon. However, as soon as once Lur enters his house, the Barbaloots use an apple to attract the donkey attention and he begins to chase it. However, after a few minutes of running, the animal reaches the top of a mountain and is exhausted, so it decides to lie down for a nap. At this point, the cart comes off the hook and starts to slide down the hill. Immediately, the donkey gets up and starts running after the vehicle, but can't catch up. When he realizes that he is about to fall off a cliff, one of the bears decides to use the fabric covering the cart as a parachute and manages to glide back to once Lur's house. Then the donkey also arrives on the scene and everyone positions themselves exactly as they were before. When the man appears, he realizes that the Barbaloots have followed his instructions and thanks them for keeping an eye on his cart. However, when the vehicle collapses, once Lur realizes that they have been up to mischief and is furious. So what did you think of this movies? Leave it in the comments below. And if you like the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.